All right, yes. Thank you again for the introduction, and I'll be talking today about Buzz-Pollination, bee flower vibrational coupling, and Robo-Buzzer prototype development. So first, I'll start with just an intro to Buzz-Pollination, and then I'll go through several of the other topics that we're talking about today. So first, what is Buzz-Pollination? Well, it's a process of pollination that involves a pollinator, a bee, often a female bee, having to grab onto the flower and physically vibrate it at high frequency in order to elicit pollen release. And this occurs while the wings are locked into place, so it actually uses the same muscles that it uses to fly to produce these buzzing vibrations, but locks its wings in place. And we can hear that sound. That initial sound is the flight buzz, and then that higher pitched series of buzzes is the pollination buzz. And in this case, that's occurring at about 320 hertz as a series of short pulses. And this process has been studied for a while, but there are, and only bees utilize this method. But it is very important for a wide variety of plants, including important crop species. And we'd like to learn even more about it. Sorry. So, coming into this project, we're about my colleagues in Sweden and I are about a year and a half into this grant. And we started out with some open questions. This is one of them. Do bees vibrate at optimal frequencies for pollen release? So, what is the meaning of that 320 hertz? And this has been approached in a variety of ways in the past, including using studies of real bees, like we just heard and saw. And when that's done, no particular correlation has been seen between the frequency of the buzz and the size of the bee. And this is in contrast to a very strong inverse relation for flapping frequency. The smaller the bee, the higher the flapping frequency. And then, on the other hand, artificial vibration has been used to apply large external shakers to the anther and excite vibrations over a wide range of frequencies and amplitudes. And when that's been done, no particular optimal frequency has been found. You can vibrate it at any different frequency. So what's going on here? Does this mean that there isn't an optimal frequency or that bees aren't using an optimal frequency? Well, we felt that this wasn't the end of the story, that there were some issues with how these experiments were done. In particular, that using artificial vibrations primarily had a very different boundary condition than a real bee sitting on the flower. And then when experiments were done looking at the real bees, the location and manner of grasping typically hadn't been included, and that can change the resonant frequencies a lot. So we felt there was a big opportunity to look at these more closely. And the way that our project is going to approach this is going to has been involving using micro-robots to learn more about biology. So let me tell you a little bit about what I mean by that. So this is just showing a kind of interplay between biology and bio-inspired robotics in general. My side of the project is the bio-inspired robotics, and my colleague, Professor Mario Avila-Romaran in Uppsala, is on the biology side. So this is very general, could be applied to many things. I worked in the past on flapping wing vehicles inspired by bees. And so we have the idea that, if you study insects, we can learn how they behave. We can make biomimicry that we can then use to have applications in a variety of engineering contexts. But for the point of this project, we go the other direction and we use controlled experiments that we can get out of the robotic devices. So you can't tell a bee, hey, we wonder what would happen if you vibrated in a different frequency, you grabbed the flower in a different way. And that's where having these little micro-robots, we think, can make a big insight, again, for the behavior of the bee. So what micro kind of robots will we use for this study? Well, we can look back at what I have worked on in the past. Like I said, was making these flapping wing vehicles. And they used piezoelectric actuators to flap the wings as artificial muscles. So I'm just showing this here to give you the context of why are we using piezoelectric actuators and what are they. They're a material that when you apply an electric field across it, it contracts or expands. If you bond two together, it bends back and forth, as shown here. And although that's not quite the same configuration as a muscle, it does produce force displacement frequency range at the end of that motion for the same mass or maybe even smaller mass than a bee's muscle. So we'll be able to actually put these on the flower and have their appropriate boundary conditions. So with that, we started thinking about, what might we do? And this is just in simulation, but kind of trying to drive home that point about that the boundary conditions matter. So, this is a toy example of a model of an anther that's not super realistic, but just to give you the idea that if you shake something from a big, heavy object at one end, you have a very different frequency response across there than you do if you have a small device vibrating sitting on the flower. And even if you just subtly change how it attaches to the flower, the top two versus the bottom two can rotate or not about their base. And then if it's connected at one point or two, and that all makes a big difference. So we started making these things, and these are still very simple, of course, just have something that can buzz and is the right weight. And we can see them here vibrating at a few hundred hertz. And initial test showed that if we twisted some wire legs for the moment, the goal is to have some mechanism to grasp onto the flowers as well. But starting with the beginning, we had these little wire legs. And then at 300 hertz, it starts to slip off. You can maybe see the pollen a little, but we'll see it better in this one. There we go. So you don't really see the vibration because it's not a high-speed camera in this initial test, but you can see the pollen release. So, we started at the beginning looking at something like this, and then we were planning, okay, we're going to have to put graspers and these kind of things on. But in parallel at the beginning, as we started the project, my colleagues in Uppsala started to really look very closely at what the bee behavior is. And, so that's very important, so we can have a nice feedback interaction here where we learn more about the bees, we learn more about what kind of devices we need in order to study the bee behavior. So my colleagues got these really nice high-speed, high-zoom videos here, and we saw some interesting things that we hadn't been thinking about before, and we'll see when it comes up. Basically, it's not as simple as just it grabbing onto it. I don't have my pointer here, but if you look closely at the jaw of the bee is biting the flower, so that's been known, but now in the zoom in there, the head is actually vibrating back and forth. And here it's not biting, but it's all still vibrating. And then when it bites, it shakes the flower a lot more. And maybe you saw the pollen coming out of the anther in that case. So basically, what we see is that the head acts as an amplifier of the thorax motion, and allows it to then bite the flower, amplify that thorax motion to the end of its jaw, and shake the flower a lot harder when it bites versus when it doesn't. And we can see that maybe even more clearly in this other species, Astrastratum, when the individual anther is looser, it shakes it tremendously when it bites, and not so much when it's not biting. And then we were looking at, here we go. Just wanted to skip ahead to, we'll skip that. So, we see these nice videos, we can see some things right away from it, like the importance of this head motion. But of course, we go and analyze all the data in detail. This is the setup that we used, high-speed camera like you saw. And the key was having some automated point tracking in there so that we could get numerically what the results were. And in particular, you could see pretty clearly in those videos the mandible jaw moving and the anther moving. The thorax motion is harder to tell by eye because it's sort of hidden by all of the fur of the bee. But my colleagues were able to measure 2 points on there that labeled MN and MP, and actually measure the contraction, expansion of the thorax muscle in time, and see how that corresponded to the motion of the mandible. Basically, whenever the bee's body contracts, the head bends forward. And so you see here, like I was saying, I'll go through the details. So this is one example of the waveform. So in this plot, you see, about all of the different data from a bunch of different videos together. I'll just step through a couple of key points for these two different flower species. So one, as I mentioned, the anther motion doubles when you are biting versus not biting. And you might have wondered, if you didn't know anything about the thorax, is that just a coincident behavior? When it bites, it also powers its muscles more, but our results show that no, that the thorax is moving the whole time. It's just that it transmits the vibration better when it bites. And that is really driving us towards this. The head bobbing is a key transmission mechanism for the vibration. And then here we see that for, say, Dulcimera on the top, the motion of the mandible decreases a bit when it bites. You saw that in the video. That kind of corresponds to potentially the stiffness of that flower or its inertia when it grabs onto it. That is less apparent in Estrostratum. We don't have enough significance in the data to say if there's a reduction there or not. But that makes intuitive sense because the Estrostratum individual anthers are significantly less stiff than the Dulcimera ones. So this was the thing I skipped in the video. We also looked at the angle at which it bites, and we're trying to learn about, how does that affect things. So one aspect is simply that if it bites at a different angle, basically its head is rotating about some region in its neck. So depending on that angle, it's going to move the anther in a different direction. And this may be better or worse depending on the type of flower and what the bee can do. We also have some indication, I won't go through this data in detail, about which way it does those angles in different species. So we'll move on. I think I'll skip talking about the anther properties, but we also want to model those so that we can include them in simulations. So I'll just say, we're looking at those in order to measure what mass and stiffness and damping properties are by matching simulation to experiment. And we can do that in multiple ways. That first one was in MATLAB simulation. This is a method using CT scans and COMSOL modeling. So with those, I'm kind of giving you these things one step at a time, but we actually have a feedback where as soon as we saw the videos with the bees where the head motion was really important, we're like, okay, we got to make that in the robot. So this all kind of happens in parallel. So what do we want to do with a design for the device? So I came up with something like this that is going to have several actuators, muscles, instead of the one, and be connected to some kind of head that would move. And then in addition, we have a second pair of actuators perpendicular that idea is that it will be a control, so we can vibrate those without the head vibrating. We've also made it all modular, so you can pop off and on the different parts, but then you do change the experiment a little bit. And some of the questions that we don't really know fully yet are, how is it physically connected between the body and the head? So there's three possibilities here that we listed out. On the top, it's something that we call basically what's shown in that video, a purely kinematic connection. Every contraction of the thorax muscle makes the head move in a prescribed way. We actually already know that that can't be the case for the real bee, because that ratio changed when it was biting versus not biting. In the center one, we see an option that's totally passive flexure joint in the neck. It doesn't directly make it move in any way. It's just like you vibrate one thing and there's something loose hanging on the end. And the third one is some combination where if you didn't have any load at the end of the head, it wasn't biting anything, it will make it go in a prescribed motion. But if you start changing, it's biting on something, you change the mass, then that flexibility in the neck will occur. So to show you what that might look like in some simulations first, something like this is comparing the first and the third, totally kinematic to totally passive as I'm describing it. And in this situation, it's a lot worse if it's totally passive because it doesn't transfer the vibrations very well. You need more than 3 times the thorax motion to get to the same anther motion. Now, these are kind of, we're trying to understand what the pros and cons are, right? It doesn't tell us that this is what the bee is doing. And then we can look at, and this device also enables us to affect these properties. So when we're having something that has two ways of rotating, there's two centers of rotation. Where are they located relative to each other? We don't know in the real bee if there's even something similar to this. There may be, like this way of having the thorax compress, making some deformation at the top of the base of the neck is plausible. There are features in the exoskeleton of the bee that look similar-ish. But what I'm showing here is that there's a change if you offset these 2 points, that if it rotates about the same point, it doesn't transmit effectively when there's a flexible neck on the bottom left. But if those two locations are not coincident, then even with a flexible neck, you get a good transmission of vibration. So, we had some of those things in mind. Then my research associate started building these, and there's a range of different sizes and all the different parts. I know I'm a little short on time, so I'll just show you the videos of them bobbing their little fake heads there. We still have some limitation here that the real bee does have some ability to move its head with muscles in its neck, in addition to whatever this vibration is that's transmitted from the thorax. So we don't have that yet. Instead, we just have to pop off and on different heads that start at different angles, as I'm showing here. And then we can also even pop off and on different shoulders that give us different amplification ratios. So now we're amplifying the thorax motion more in this case. So I won't really say much about, we have a lot of next steps to, actually use both of these versions of the Robo-Buzzer in controlled experiments. And we also want to implement the grasper idea that we've been thinking about, because we do think it will still be important how it actually grabs onto the flower, as well as this head bobbing motion. And this is, something we can look at in the simulation and say, gee, this should matter, and we don't know the answer in the real bee. If it grabs the anther very firmly, it doesn't work very well because it's sort of limited in the degrees of freedom on the bottom. But on the top, if it sort of weakly holds it, allows it to rotate, it can work better in simulation. So we'll see what the reality is. And with that, I would like to thank all of the researchers and collaborators involved in the project, and of course the Human Frontier Science Program for the great opportunity. Thank you very much. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much for this fascinating insights into what happens during pollination. We have time for 2 questions, I guess. Who has a question? The first one. We have to break the ice probably. Over there, Guntram, down here.
Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I have a question regarding the anatomy of a flower. Okay,
yes.
How it matters for, all movements that the bee executes, and whether you are going to. I saw 2 flowers that you tested, but are you going to test some weird, anatomies, more difficult or less difficult flowers to pollinate, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, I think the anatomy of the flower certainly matters. That's why we do need to include an understanding of that. I just didn't have time to talk through all of that in detail. But I guess, it matters in the sense of, if the bee is visiting different kind of flowers, does it behave differently? And again, we can't actually know if the bee does that, why it did it. And we do see differences even with these 2 flower species, that it tends to bite closer to perpendicular versus closer to parallel, and one of them is a different size, all these kind of things. So we can certainly observe those differences. If we have the little micro-robots maybe, and simulation understanding, maybe we can understand why those behaviors are different. And yeah, what the coevolution is, of course, as well. So.
Fascinating talk. Wondering, could your endpoint be an artificial bee drone that can actually step in and pollinate, and how long will it take you to make one?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think we want to save the real bees, but it's conceivable, of course. I think that at this stage we're trying to understand some basic questions about only some species of bees pollinate, and also flies don't do this buzz pollination, but they have similar vibrational frequencies. So if we can understand why that is, maybe we can say, gee, you know, this crop species could actually be pollinated by this other species of insect. I think we'd probably think more on those lines than making a swarm of artificial ones, but you know, it's very interesting to think about the possibilities.
Fascinating. Thank you again.
Thank you.